Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Burning of Washington when the British burned down the White House. Yeah, guys, what's with that? Why'd you do that?
On January the 6th.
The burning of Washington when the British burned down the White House. Preemptive like War Graphics, fantastic, phenomenal channel. Let's go. I said the things. All right. My name's Connor. How are you? Good. Let's watch
2021, the United States Capitol was overrun. Protesters objecting to the certification of the 2020 election in which Joe Biden won over incumbent Donald Trump storms the Capitol, attacking police officers, breaking windows, and calling for the execution of elected officials. It was a direct attack on American democracy that we have never seen in our lifetimes. And yet, throughout American history, the nation's capital has held. Congress was never attacked throughout both world wars, and even during the Civil War, during which the country's greatest threat was his own citizens, Washington, D.C. was never attacked. However, just a few decades into the country's history, its democracy was nearly toppled. On August the 24th, 1814, America's capital city was burned to the ground. 2 years into a bloody war, the United Kingdom had gotten the upper hand against its former territory, attacking the heart of America and nearly taking the country with it. On today's War Graphics, we're going to be taking a look at the burning of Washington when the British burned down the White House.
We're not watching it. No. All right, let's go. Let's learn. Jokes aside. Who is that?
The War of 1812, as it is known today, is a war whose causes are still being debated by historians. Throughout the 19th century, it was often referred to as the Second War for Independence, though this name is hardly accurate as the British were not trying to reclaim the land that they lost after the colonies declared independence in 1776. According to the USS Constitution Museum, two major causes were the British...
1812, I mean, what stage of the Napoleonic Wars is that? Is that in between the first time Napoleon got captured and Waterloo? Yeah, curious. Wow, so the British were fighting a major war against Napoleonic France, and at the same time, easily just wiped Americans to the side and burnt down the White House? God. We were new.
Orders in Council, which limited America's ability to trade with Europe, as well as impressments, which was the...
All right, I gotta stop talking. Just...
According to the USS Constitution Museum, two major causes were the British Orders in Council, which limited America's ability to trade with Europe, as well as impressments, which was the Royal Navy's practice of taking seamen from American merchant vessels to fill out the crews of its own chronically undermanned warships. In fact, historian Alan Taylor goes so far as to call the conflict a civil war, as the young country still had many citizens loyal to the United Kingdom. Under President James Madison, who was also one of the country's original founding fathers, the United States officially declared war on June the 18th, 1812.
Guys, I wonder at what point did the American accent sound distinctively American? Because if they were British, you know, in British colonies, British people in British colonies, speaking British... I wonder, like, at what point was it like, all right, that's clearly an American accent, not a British or British colonial accent? Ever wonder that?
Following year, Madison named John Armstrong Jr., former minister to France under Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of War, and Armstrong quickly organized an attack on York, the capital of Upper Canada, today known as Toronto. On April the 27th, 1813, an American force attacked the town, overwhelming the city. Following the battle, soldiers looted York and committed arson before withdrawing several days later. The attack on the capital angered the British, particularly because the city was of little strategic importance. One reason for the United Kingdom's lackluster military during the War of 1812 was that they were fighting two wars at once, the other being against Napoleon in France. After Napoleon's capture, then exile in April 1814, the British were able to fully focus their military might on America. John Armstrong had insisted to President Madison that the British would avoid attacking the capital as it was strategically unimportant, seemingly unaware of his actions the previous year. Nonetheless, Madison designated the area around Washington and Baltimore as a military district, appointing Brigadier General William H. Winder as its commander. Winder suggested to Armstrong to call up militia in anticipation of an attack, but Armstrong denied his request. That August, the United Kingdom sent Rear Admiral George Cockburn and Major General Robert Ross to lead a fleet into Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. Both men had fought in the Napoleonic Wars, with Ross having suffered a severe neck injury during the Battle of Orthez. After landing at Benedict,
I have to pick a monitor.
Napoleonic Wars, with Ross having suffered a severe neck injury during the Battle of Orthez. After landing at Benedict, alongside the Patuxent River, their forces marched north to Bladensburg, east of Washington. On August the 24th, 1814, they met the American forces led by Winder, as well as Secretary of State James Monroe. What ensued was described by historian Daniel Walker Howe as the most humiliating episode in American history. While the American soldiers had superior numbers, 6,000 soldiers to Robert Ross's 4,500, they were also inexperienced and disorganized. The attack came seemingly out of nowhere, and while the Americans fought with a sense of patriotism, trying their hardest to defend their country from foreign invaders, President Madison witnessed the battle firsthand. The opposition newspaper Federal Republican would say the president was the first to fly, while other reports said that he waited to learn the outcome of the battle before returning to Washington. Either way, he retreated and would never spend another night in the White House.
I did not know
that.
While
the Battle of Bladensburg raged, First Lady Dolly Madison had been preparing a dinner for him back at the White House. Dolly was a socialite who organized events at the home and was the first wife of a president to assume the role of house's hostess. In fact, she had even been the hostess during Thomas Jefferson's presidency. As her servant, Paul Jennings recalled the events of that evening. Mrs. Madison ordered dinner to be ready at 3 as usual. It must be noted here that Jennings and other servants at the White House were slaves. While the Madisons treated their slaves relatively well, they were still slaves, nonetheless. Citizens in the city had heard the sounds of battle off in the distance, hoping for the best once the firing stopped. To their dismay, Secretary of War John Armstrong soon arrived with his men saying, "Fly, fly, the ruffians are at hand. If you cannot get away yourselves, for God's sake send off your wives and daughters, for the ruffians are at hand."
Ruffians.
His words were no exaggeration, as Rear Admiral George Cockburn had a reputation for burning and looting. Days earlier, the citizens had been living peacefully, but now they had to flee the city, for their lives were at stake. Dolly Madison resisted leaving her home as long as she...
Really shows you how, again, they were fighting... it wasn't... Imagine how easily they could have really done damage in the U.S. if they had all of their might and it wasn't just, you know, a side quest of the Napoleonic Wars, which is what it seems.
She could, having promised her husband that she would be waiting for him. Dolly Madison resisted leaving her home as long as she could, having promised her husband that she would be waiting for him when he had left 2 days earlier. It was only after 2 messengers, covered with dust, informed her of the outcome of the battle that she decided to pack up and leave. She had her servants, slaves, pack up a wagon full of precious White House belongings. A particular note was a large picture of America's first president, George Washington. The painting, having been painted back in 1800, was a national icon. Dolly Madison ordered her staff to save that painting. Save that painting. It was difficult to unscrew it from the wall, but they managed to break the frame and transport the picture to safety. Another object reported to have been evacuated that night was James Madison's crystal flute, made by Claude Laurent of Paris in 1813, though there is no official documentation on the items that were moved. Once they had secured as much as they could, Dolly and her servants fled the White House. Soon after, President Madison briefly stopped by the home, having one of his attendants transport Dolly's pet macaw to the house of the French ambassador for safety. What few families were still left in the city were quickly evacuated by the army. Commandant Thomas Tingey of the U.S. Navy Yard made the order to destroy as much of the yard as his men could, specifically everything that may be valuable and useful to the enemy. Before the British had even entered the city, the fires had already started. When Robert Ross and George Cockburn arrived, what followed were acts of destruction that divided opinion among even their own staff. Any chance of negotiation with America died when shots were fired from a house south of the city. Ross's horse was killed instantly, along with a British soldier. Troops promptly stormed the house and burned it down. The destruction of Washington had begun. For the first time in American history...
I hope you guys know I'm not, like, serious and, like, you did this. Well, you technically did, but obviously I hope I'm not coming across as, you know, How dare you?
For the first time in American history, and the only time for centuries, the United States Capitol building was overrun. For a moment, the British took in the design of the building, taking note of the bald eagle carved over the speaker's chair. An official described the eagle as looking towards the skies, emblematic, it is to be presumed, of the rising greatness of the young nation. Of course, the story goes that George Cockburn sat down in the chair and asked his men, "Shall this harbor of Yankee democracy be burned?" To which his men yelled, "Aye." They soon piled all the chairs, furniture, library books, and papers and set it ablaze. Not long after, the entire building was on fire, including the Library of Congress. Cockburn took a memento for himself.
I thought they had a bigger sort of party before. Where did I hear that?
Off a book with the words,
like, am I mixing it with something else? There was food like ready and sorry.
Library books and papers and set it ablaze. Not long after, the entire building was on fire.
I was so confused because I thought that I didn't know that the Capitol, Library of Congress, and the White House and several other buildings were all burned down, but that makes a lot more sense, seeing as they were taking revenge for Toronto, and why would they only burn down the White House? So I need to learn more American history. It's shameful at this point.
The entire building was on fire, including the Library of Congress. Cockburn took a memento for himself, a book with the words, "The President of the United States," stamped on the cover, which contained copies of the government's receipts and payments for the year 1810. The book was not given back to the Library of Congress until 1940, over a century later. The night sky over the city began to glow red due to the fires at Congress.
Why in 1940? You trying to, like, make nice with us now that World War II is raging? Or maybe it's just a coincidence.
In the Navy Yard. To some British, the destruction of the printing presses and the National Archives was a step too far. Citizens who had stayed in the city to care for loved ones watched in horror as their capital burned. Yet, there was also a sense of dignity among segments of the British. Some soldiers politely knocked on the doors of homes that had not been evacuated, requesting bread and wine to feed themselves, as American citizen James Ewell put it, conducting themselves with the utmost good behavior. All would wind up speaking to George Cockburn himself, complaining that his home had been looted by the less considerate soldiers. Cockburn showed no sympathy, but when General Robert Ross overheard the conversation between the two men, he asked Ewell which house was his, so that he could order a sentinel to guard it. As it turned out, his home had been chosen by Ross as a temporary headquarters during the night, as they thought it had been abandoned. The two made an amicable arrangement, and Ewell allowed the general to stay at his home that night, with Ross agreeing to cause as little trouble as possible. Many Americans would consider Ewell a traitor for his actions that night, though he hoped treating Ross with respect would help mend the divide between the two nations. Ewell was not the only American who was able to speak.
I don't know if that's traitor.
Amicably, respect would help mend the divide.
I mean, you'd probably be I don't know.
Between the two nations. Ewell was not the only American who was able to speak amicably with the British. When officers talked of burning down the Washington Bank, a woman convinced them to spare it, as the fire would have spread to nearby homes. Ross himself worked hard to make sure that his men were not accused of looting, going so far as to stop American looters from taking advantage of the chaos. Finally, Cockburn and Ross made their way down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. Upon going inside, the men smelled the food.
It's a crazy scene. Imagine British soldiers who just invaded the U.S. Capitol, and they're ordering Americans not to loot American or homes or buildings. Jeez.
Drink that had been prepared for Madison earlier that day, laid out on the table.
Nothing changes, I guess.
They'd not eaten since that morning, and happily sat down to eat a meal fit for a president. After the White House had been stripped of all of its valuables, supposedly including a portrait of Dolly Madison, evidently the First Lady had deemed the portrait of George Washington to be of greater value, Cockburn and Ross set about lighting America's most famous building ablaze. While in the city, Ross had taken great care not to harm those who had shown no resistance, but this time he was ready to get revenge for what had happened at York in Upper Canada. The fire spread quickly. One of the soldiers noted he felt sorrow when witnessing such magnificent buildings demolished. It was a terrifying moment for American citizens.
I really want to look up after this what the first White House looked like and how how much the second one was inspired of it, if not a direct.
In some ways, they had gone off easy.
Not a copy.
After all, Ross had done his best to spare civilians, his main targets being the government buildings. While the outer stone walls were not combustible, the inside of the White House was destroyed. It rained the following morning, putting out the fire and sparing the building from even more damage. The next day, a horseman rode into town, wildly firing his pistols at British troops. The man was John Lewis, who happened to be George Washington's nephew. Lewis had been a seafarer who had been forcibly impressed by the British and made to fight against his own country. Now he was on a suicide mission, firing at whoever he could before being gunned down dead in the street. Ross and Coburn continued to destroy what they could, at times having to debate whether to burn or spare a building. The War Office was burned, while the Patent Office was spared. Finally, they ordered their troops to exit the city in order to prepare for the next target, Baltimore.
Over the ramparts we watched.
While the burning of Washington was no doubt a victory for the British, Ross and Coburn also recognized that it was not the killing blow that they needed. Now, with America's leadership scattered and humiliated, they began...
Sorry, what's that flag? That doesn't look like the Union Jack.
Not the killing blow that they needed. Now, with America's leadership scattered and humiliated, they began preparing for an assault on the nearby Fort McHenry near Baltimore, Maryland, with the hopes of winning the war once and for all. The fort, named after American statesman and Scots-Irish immigrant James McHenry, was built in 1798. Located southeast of the city of Baltimore, overlooking Chesapeake Bay, the subsequent battle would go down in history as one of the defining moments of American culture. Fingers were pointed among James Madison's administration. For many, Secretary of War John Armstrong was to blame for the loss of Bladensburg and the subsequent burning of the nation's capital. In the days following a meeting with Madison, Armstrong resigned. Secretary of State James Monroe would take over his responsibilities for the remainder of the war. The British prepared for the attack of Baltimore, but Ross had his reservations about the plan's success. After all, the Americans were now concerned and would rally around this next battle. British troops, as aroused as they were from their recent victories, were still tired from the battles and needed time to rest before the next attack. Baltimoreans would bolster their defenses the best they could while they had the chance. A year prior to the battle, in 1813, a young woman named Mary Young Pickersgill would be commissioned to make two oversized American flags, the larger of which was the Great Garrison flag, which was made to be a flag so large that the British would have no difficulty seeing it from a distance. The flag would be flown over Fort McHenry during the battle. For Robert Ross, however, he would not live to see this coming showdown between the two nations. As he and Coburn advanced their troops up North Point, east of Baltimore, he was shot dead on his horse. Ross, who had fought in battles with both Napoleonic France and America, died on September the 12th, 1814, just weeks after burning America's capital city. That same day, the assault on Fort McHenry began. East of Baltimore, forces clashed at North Point.
I want to know who was more difficult. Voice crack. That shows you how not confident. I wonder what his opinion would have been on his experience against Napoleonic soldiers versus American soldiers. Probably.
That same day, the assault on Fort McHenry began. East of Baltimore, forces clashed at North Point, while Fort McHenry was assaulted by the British naval fleet led by Alexander Cochrane. For the next 25 hours, the fort was bombarded by British ships, rockets lighting up the night sky. Now imagine that you were
Cochrane, is that the same? Why does Alexander Cochrane not sound right? Is he the same one who... HMS Speedy? Bolivia? No, he like helped with some South American independence movements from Spain, right? Or HMS...
American citizen living in Baltimore at the time. Weeks earlier, your capital city was...
Sorry, all right.
For the next 25 hours, the fort was bombarded by British ships, rockets lighting up the night sky. Now imagine that you were an American citizen living in Baltimore at the time.
Thomas
Weeks earlier, your capital city was overrun and your government buildings were burned to the ground. Now your own city is under assault. The best you can do is stay at home and hope for the best. Yet when you look out your window at Fort McHenry, you see the giant American flag waving proudly in defiance of the British. American poet Francis Scott Key witnessed the assault on Baltimore that night, having been imprisoned on a British ship. As he watched the battle unfold, he was inspired to write a poem that would become the most famous song in American history. Many Americans know the Star-Spangled Banner, but the lyrics take on a whole new meaning when you learn the original context in which they were written. And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. After more than a full day of fighting...
Chills. I just got chills. I know you guys want, but I can't deny it.
But the lyrics take on a whole new meaning when you learn the original context in which they were written. And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. After more than a full day of fighting, the British were forced to retreat, having run low on ammunition, nor having made any progress in capturing the city. As far as Americans were concerned, the battle was a resounding victory, having successfully defended their country during the darkest moment in its history. Their capital may have been burned to the ground, but their country lived on. On December the 24th, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed, signaling the end of the war. After 2 years of fighting, neither the US or the UK had gained anything. Parties on both sides were relieved that the war was over. Well, kind of. It took a month for news of the treaty to reach everyone involved, and the last major battle of the War of 1812 happened after the truce had actually been declared. On January the 8th, 1815, General Andrew Jackson defended the city of New Orleans from British attack. To this day, historians still debate the importance of Jackson's victory. Would the British have honored their treaty if they had won the battle, or would their victory have emboldened them to disregard it and make another attempt at overthrowing America? It's hard to say. Either way, the war was over, and the two nations could begin to move forward.
I love that moment, okay? Call me a Merabrain, what are your typical freedom, whatever, I don't care. That was an amazing, chilling moment that I had that I don't have often in videos, and I love it. And yeah.
Prior to the burning of Washington, Secretary of War John Armstrong Jr. and Secretary of State James Monroe were both eyeing to become James Madison's successor to the presidency. After Armstrong's perceived failure to protect the capital, the question of who would be the next president was no longer a question. In 1817, James Monroe was sworn in as America's fifth president, a position he would hold for the next 8 years. 20 years after the event, James Madison would pass away on June the 28th, 1836, at the age of 85. His wife Dolly would be considered among historians to be among the best first ladies in history for her bravery that night. She
saving the Washington painting, and yeah, very nice. It's interesting how the first few presidents of the United States were all very significant, seemingly very or pretty significant figures. And it seems like, nowadays just anyone can run. Just run, Trump, yeah, whatever. Like, what? But I don't know if that's due because they just didn't trust anyone else. I don't know if that's what they always meant it to be, or if because that's obviously going to be needed in the birth of the country. In order to get it on its feet, it's smart to have people who are very influential in its beginning or connected to people who are influential to get the cart rolling, does that make sense? Yeah, I don't know. I just noticed that.
Passed away a decade after her husband on July the 12th, 1849. After the War of 1812,
it's gotta be the latter.
The United States and the United Kingdom would never go to war again. Instead, a century later, the two countries were allies during the two world wars. In March 2012, President Barack Obama, who also happens to be James Madison's third cousin 9 times removed, welcomed British Prime Minister David Cameron to the White House. At a press conference, Obama said,
by those terms.
"It's now been almost 200 years since the British came here to the White House under somewhat different circumstances. They really made an impression. They lit the place up." To which Cameron responded, "You've got the place a little better defended today. You're clearly not taking any chances with the Brits this time." Francis Scott Key's poem, The Defense of Fort McHenry,
that's a nice exchange,
was later set to the tune of Tu Ancrian in Heaven, a drinking song named after the Greek poet Anacreon. In 1931, the song became officially recognized as the national anthem of the United States. In 2022, the musician Lizzo made headlines when she played James Madison's crystal flute on stage, saying, "There was a fire, and the only two things that were saved were a portrait of George Washington and this crystal flute right here." While historians do believe the flute was saved from the fire that night, she certainly left out a lot of context. Since 1814, only 2 attempts have been made to strike at the...
Should we watch the Lizzo playing the flute after?
Left out a lot of context. Since 1814, only 2 attempts have been made to strike at the United States government directly. One was on September the 11th, 2001, when 4 airplanes were hijacked by terrorists. 2 at the World Trade Centers in New York City, a 3rd at the Pentagon building in Washington, and while we do not know the 4th plane's target, as it crashed in Pennsylvania, its flight path suggests it was headed towards the United States Capitol.
I only slightly remember the buildings smoking. That's all I really remember, because I could tell it was a different thing. I know I'm going on a tangent, whatever. But I do remember my mom's expression looking at the TV of just like, Yeah, this isn't about 9/11. I just wanted to.
That day, President George.
I was 8 years old, I think.
George W. Bush hid in anticipation of a potential threat on his life, becoming a fugitive in his own country, similar to Madison. The other attempt on the federal government was on January the 6th, 2021, when protesters tried to stop the certification of Joe Biden's election, falsely claiming the election had been rigged against then-President Donald Trump, becoming the only instance since 2014 when the Capitol building had been overrun, falsely claiming the election had been rigged against then-President Donald Trump. Surprisingly, the burning of Washington has become mostly forgotten by American citizens. Perhaps it's due to the War of 1812 being glossed over in its history textbooks. The war was unpopular and ended in a stalemate, with neither side having gained much at all. It was a humiliating episode of United States history, one that the country would have preferred to forget. While the White House has undergone a lot of renovations over the years, parts of the building still bear the scars from that night. As for the painting of George Washington, in 2009, descendants of Paul Jennings, the slave who helped Dolly Madison save the painting, were invited to see the portrait for themselves. The painting remains in the White House to this day.
I'm so ashamed at how many... First of all, screw you guys. No. Love you guys. You're awesome. But I am so ashamed by how little I knew about all this stuff and how much I messed up. I thought it was only the White House, and I thought they were in the Capitol, that when they were talking about the Capitol being burned, I thought that was the White House. I was confused. There's a few other things just stupidly I said. And, yeah, really great video. Love war graphics. Hope you guys are doing well. What was I going to say? I had something to say. I'll see you guys next time. I'll see you next time. What is it? Oh, yeah. And I thought that the whole White House was burnt down, and I forgot that it was still the basis of the White House, so it wasn't... Anyways, I'll see you guys next time. Bye, guys.